So again, there is no law in Kenya that says that you cannot take these statues out of the country, hence what John is doing is not technically illegal. So for the elders, the statues continue to be these inalienable objects that incarnate the ancestral spirits. But for the Mijikenda youths that steal them, we find this very interesting. We have the third author on our papers, John Mitsanze, is a local Giriama man who works as our research assistant. And we have asked him just to keep his ear to the ground so that he can get information about what these thieves are doing. And one of the things that he's learned is that when the youths steal the statues, they actually perform a little ritual that they believe is going to counteract the curse of the ancestors before they take the statue and sell it. So we find that very interesting because they're obviously kind of between thinking about the statues as something they can sell and believing in the ancestral curse, in the inalienability or the singularity of the object. So there's a change going on between the elders and the youths. What we're most perplexed about is John, our art dealer, who, as I said, is apparently a very friendly guy and who knows the meaning of these statues and yet traffics in them anyway. And then finally, interviews that are ongoing that I conducted last summer and that I continue to conduct with Western collectors and donors on the meaning of these statues. And I've just started getting into interviewing the actual donors of the statues. And I'm trying to figure out, how do I contact these huge Hollywood celebrities to find out why they purchased these particular kinds of objects, what was their interest in African art, et cetera. It's hard to get to those Hollywood celebrities, but I guess I have to go through their agents or something to get interviews with them. But that's one thing that I still want to do. And I have not personally spoken to John myself. I'm saving him for last. I want to know exactly all the pieces of how these statues move around the world and ultimately wind up in museums before I actually interview John, although I'm pretty sure he knows about our research and he may not want to talk to me, but we will try. Okay. So what I've tried to do is to convey the meaning in this case of objects, property that is part of a living cultural tradition, and what it means for the people who create these objects. The theft of these statues is changing local culture. And of course, it's being driven by that appeal that African objects have in the West. It's illegal to steal the statues, but it's almost impossible to document it. The fact that I was able to document the theft of katana statues is extremely rare, and of course just happened randomly. I just happened to be there, and within a month they were stolen, so I can show the photographs and say those, I can document from my field notes that katana said these were stolen in the last month. It's extremely rare to be able to have that kind of documentation of theft of artifacts from the non-Western world. There is legislation, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the 1970 UNESCO legislation. It's got a great big long name, the Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. It's a big, long piece of legislation with very lofty goals that requires signing parties to do many of these things. The problem is, problem number one, most countries have still not signed this legislation. And without signing and ratifying the document, it's not considered legal in that country. The United States has signed it, but many Western European nations have not. Can any of you think of why that would be? that several Western European nations have refused to sign this piece of legislation preventing and requiring the return of stolen objects. Well, it's because, of course, for hundreds of years, the Western European nations have been plundering objects from one another, like the Elgin marbles in Great Britain, if you're familiar with those, that Greece wants returned to them, and any number of very valuable objects being held by one European nation and believed to be unrightly held to be returned to some other European nation. So if those Western European nations were to sign this piece of legislation, they would have to return what are now considered very valuable parts of their own country's wealth. So we've got a great big problem right there. The other piece of legislation that I talked about, the UNIDROIT Convention on Stolen or Illegally Exported Cultural Objects, became a more specific document to follow up the 1970 UNESCO Convention, and specifically laid out that anyone possessing illicit property must return it. So for example, I have contacted both Illinois State University and Hampton University and said, I can prove these two statues were stolen and we want them repatriated, and those two universities have no choice but to say, yes, of course, you can have them to be repatriated. Now, if the universities wanted to, they could ask for compensation for returning those objects. And according to the UNIDROIT legislation, it is the country of origin of the object that has to pay compensation. So here's a great big problem. Non-Western countries tend to be very poor, and they can't afford to pay compensation for vigango that costs several $1,000s, let alone other objects that can be worth tens of thousands of dollars, like some of those heads, the bronze head and the terracotta head that you saw at the beginning of the talk. They can't afford to pay that. One good part of this legislation is that it now includes not just archaeological objects, ancient objects, but also objects like the memorial statues that are parts of living cultures today. So you can see that there are problems with both of these pieces of legislation. Something that we are pushing for is that museums, which are kind of the end point of objects that are trafficked around the world. In other words, ultimately, what tends to happen is that Western collectors get tired of the objects, they get interested in a new category of object, or else they die, and they stipulate in their will that their fabulous collection of whatever should be donated to a particular museum. One of the things that we are advocating for is that museums need to be a lot more proactive in deterring the theft of objects from their points of origin. The International Council of Museums itself has a code of ethics that was enacted about 10 years ago that stipulates that museums may not accept donations that can be shown to have been in any way part of a global art market, and they have to make sure in accepting a donation that the object was not stolen. The problem, of course, is that people very rarely know whether an object was stolen. Like the case of my statues, these young unemployed youths go down to a shopkeeper, sell the statue for $50. Then a Western art dealer comes to this middleman, buys the object. This is the typical scenario anywhere in the non-Western world, puts it in a container, and ships it to the West.